Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So recently I did another video about the Indian putter sword or gauntlet sword, and some comments that came up from that I thought I should follow up with a sort of response to those comments. First thing, lots of people noticed that the thumb was often showing as being quite vulnerable when I was demonstrating. Obviously you've got to realise when I'm talking I'm gesticulating with my hands. I can actually tuck my thumb in there so it's not so vulnerable at all. You simply turn it around that way. You simply stick the thumb on the side there as if you were making a fist. And then of course it becomes a lot less vulnerable. Yes, it does stick out that way slightly, and I suppose perhaps some of these, although I haven't seen any, but perhaps some of these carry on a bit more deeply down here. Some of these putter, sort of the gauntlet parts, are actually made very, very ornately on higher status versions than this one. And a certain type had a tiger's head here with a kind of roaring mouth with the blade coming out of it. So you get some quite, much as you see on the muzzle of certain types of cannon from India and China as well. So they can be a lot more ornate than this, and yes, sometimes certainly the gauntlet part could be bigger to protect the thumb a bit more. I don't think the thumb is that vulnerable, to be honest. I mean, certainly compared to a normal sword which doesn't have any gauntlet on the hilt, the whole hand is much better protected than normal. But yeah, I guess the thumb does stick out a bit, but presumably that wasn't a big problem for them, or they would have designed it more often to have protection for the thumb as well. The next thing that came up in the comments was some people said, oh well, if they sometimes have rapier blades, this is a broadsword, almost certainly European, probably German, could be British but probably German, broadsword blade mounted on here. Some people said, oh, I mentioned that sometimes they have rapier blades mounted instead of broadsword blades, so they said, oh, you know, I said that it wasn't used for thrusting very much and probably more for cutting, whereas they said if there were rapier blades mounted to them, that would kind of go against that argument. Well, I guess the point is that yes, rapier blades were sometimes mounted to them. However, if you look at the cross-section of surviving putters from collections, a tiny percentage, perhaps at maximum 5% of them, have rapier blades. The vast majority, let's say 95% of them, have broadsword blades. So I could turn that kind of response around and say, well, you know, if 95% of them have broadsword blades, then very clearly 95% of them were being used predominantly as cutting weapons, because that's the point of a broadsword. So clearly if 95% of these have broadsword blades on, they have broadsword blades on because they were predominantly cutting weapons. You would stick a rapier blade or some other kind of thrusting blade on rather than a broadsword blade if your primary purpose was to thrust. So I think actually, rather than it going against my argument that these are predominantly cutting rather than thrusting weapons, it actually supports it that only a very small number have the rapier blades on. The other thing I would say, of course, is that a rapier blade doesn't preclude the weapon from being used for cutting as well. I mean, rapiers are a cut and thrust sword. Yes, they are a little bit more specialised, or quite a bit more specialised to the thrust, but there are rapiers and there are rapiers. Some of them are very narrow and pointy, and others of them are more like really a narrow broadsword or a spadroon. They are true cut and thrust weapons, like a sabre is, frankly. And the final thing that came up is that one of my viewers sent me an email with a video linked to an Indian game show. That I'll put the link to that video because it's on YouTube. I'll put the link below this video. And something that when I've been talking about putters in the past, a lot of people have gone, oh, you know, they have very, very flexible blades. And I started looking around at videos on YouTube, and I saw that there were some demonstrations of guys using something that looked like a putter which had crazy flexible blades. Now, first of all, yes, I am fully aware of the existence of the urumi, or the very long flexible whip-bladed sword that is used in Rapier and other, mostly I think southern Indian martial arts. However, I am not confusing it with the urumi. The urumi is very long and is a well-known weapon, and it usually has a very simple tulwar style hilt on it. What I was referring to is specifically that people have said that this weapon, the putter with a normal length broadsword blade on it, that the blade is very flexible. Well, certainly That's not the case on historical putters, because the simple fact is they are usually European broadsword blades, and European broadsword blades are stiff. They are not really flexible. Okay, so I knew that that wasn't true, but I also didn't know where this perception came from that putters were supposed to have very flexible blades. And then my viewer kindly sent this video, which you can see below, to me, and I now realise where the perception might come from. I mentioned that there is a 19th century source, which I linked under my previous video, which talks about these being used in a sort of trick at a festival to cut limes or lemons. Now this is exactly what the person is still doing today in this modern demonstration, and obviously this shows a continuing lineage of expertise, or at least practice, of the use of this type of sword used to cut limes or lemons in this sort of sword feat or trick, okay, for demonstration purposes. And you can see this swordsman spinning around exactly like described in the 1858 descriptive account of this, and then succeeding in cutting the lemons or limes, they're lemons in this case, on the ground, on a person's, under a person's chin, under a person's foot, all of these sort of things. Now what you'll notice is his weapon has an incredibly floppy blade. Not like this, okay? This is not a floppy blade at all. This is as stiff as any broadsword or sabre, okay? His blade is very floppy. Now I got to thinking, okay, if they're using a very floppy blade in India today for this type of demonstration, and it's a sort of putter but with a very floppy blade, maybe the reason that some people think putters have floppy blades is because they've seen modern ones used, or indeed ones used in these demonstrations, which do have floppy blades, unlike the proper antique fighting versions. Now this makes a lot of sense to me, because if you make a blade very floppy, then in fact it will make it easier to do these tricks as demonstrated in the Indian video linked below. Because it means that you can essentially, as you're swinging the thing along the ground, you almost drag the blade along the ground, and it means that the blade will kind of go flat along the ground and slice through the lemon or the lime. So there we go. I now suspect, and I'm piecing this all together as you guys can see as I keep putting up new videos about it, I suspect that these floppy blades are specifically the ones made for this type of demonstration of cutting fruits, and they are made that way to make the demonstration easier, but they are not representative of the original antique sword with a European broadsword blade on it that is used in war. They're probably specialised versions of this to make that trick easier. So there we go, have a look at the video link below, it's interesting stuff, and my continuing thoughts on the putter will, I'm sure, continue. Thanks guys!